To get started, we're going to start by talking about cost of college, which was a big part of the poll. Jim, if you could take a look at just explain what the polling found on how people view the cost of college overall.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Essentially, the common phrase in Washington is that you can't find bipartisan agreement on anything, but the reality is you can find bipartisan, you just have to ask the right questions. And a question like, how expensive do you think college is? We did have bipartisan agreement, and the agreement was that everyone thinks it's very expensive. We had 69% of voters say it was very expensive, and a total say it was of 92% said it was very or somewhat expensive. So pretty much unanimous agreement on that. Looking at who is most likely to say the cost of college is very expensive, it's predominantly minorities like Hispanics and African Americans, younger voters, women, and base Democrat voting groups.
Thanks, Jim. Bill, we'll start off the conversation going to you. If you could just talk about the growth of college costs over the last decade and some of the potential problems that that creates as college becomes more and more expensive and may begin to price out some students that were looking to get a higher education.
Well, Mike, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is actually an issue that goes far beyond just the last decade. I actually served on the College Cost Commission back in the late 1990s, and it was a huge issue that Congress was even trying to grapple with back then because of the skyrocketing tuition increases. And then about a decade later, the Spellings Commission came around to look at accountability and cost, and here we are another 7 or 8 years later, and we're still talking about the same thing. And the problem just, frankly, seems to keep getting worse and worse. And a lot of the challenges we face are, when I left the government in 2003, as Deputy Secretary of Education, we were spending about $75 billion a year in Pell Grants and student loans from the federal level. Today we're spending $175 billion a year, and I would argue that we have no more access, no more affordability. In fact, things have gotten worse. We now have over $1 trillion in student loan debt. So the problems are continuing to get worse and worse. There are, I think, some good solutions out there that I think we'll be talking about in a little bit with some of the unbundling of higher education, some of the innovations that are coming to higher education. But it is a big challenge, and it really is hitting the pocketbook for the American public. With the average student loan debt, as the polling showed, is about $26,000 per graduate, and so many that have much more debt than that. That's just the average of that.
Andrew, I know this is a particular topic that you've focused a lot of your research on over the years. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the drivers of college costs and what in the last 20, 25 years has caused college tuition to skyrocket as much as it has.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Tuition's been going up by 5 to 6% a year for decades, and it wasn't really seen as a problem until pretty recently. So I'd argue that what's kind of most new is the public's perception that that's no longer an acceptable response on the part of universities. So the universities are sometimes subjected to external pressures, and some of that is causing the cost on their end to go up. But a lot of it is also internal decisions made by the universities, and that's right now is where a lot of the debate is focused on, is how much of this is being driven by factors outside of the university's control and how much of it is under their control.
Andrew, one thing that we've heard a lot about in the education research that we've done is kind of the things that are within the university's control. Essentially, that there is such a desire on the part of universities, both public and private, to essentially keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. That if a school where you're competing for students with builds a climbing wall, just to use one example, then all of a sudden, oh, we need to build 2 climbing walls. Or if someone else completely renovates their dining hall, we need to renovate our dining hall and make it even better than theirs. And that, I think, especially when parents are looking at what is being built at so many of these colleges and universities, it's not always classrooms or new labs. It's essentially more amenities, and a lot of that is what at least is perceived to be driving up the cost.
Yeah, that's a very serious concern, and things like climbing walls and things, they're easy to see. Those are mostly symbolic though, because when you look at all of the climbing walls and the swimming pools and the jacuzzis, don't cost nothing, but that's not they don't cost enough to really be driving it. But there is this academic arms race. So it's not necessarily the climbing walls, but that's the same things that are kind of urging or making the universities feel like they need to build the climbing walls are also making them feel like, hey, we need to have the highest paid faculty. We need to have, the students with the highest scores, and in order to attract them, we need to give them more and more aid. So it's that same kind of keeping up with the Joneses or trying to move up in the rankings that's driving a lot of this. And the climbing walls are kind of the public symbol of that. But the underlying problem is much, much deeper.
Ron, I want to go to you for all your years of working around college administrations and college leadership, and give you a chance to respond. And what in your view on the college side might be something that's driving college tuition up and up in the past couple years?
Well, I certainly would agree that part of the cost has been the so-called arms race that we previously identified. But it is true that the economic model of higher education is really under serious consideration. When, depending on the college or university, when between 60 and 80% of your costs are really related to personnel, it doesn't matter how many climbing walls you're building. And so the pressures that are being placed upon higher education at this point, and it was referenced, the arms race with respect to faculty, how colleges and universities balance their academic programs, the way in which they want to attract certain students at their universities. These do exactly relate to costs. And I think, and we'll probably get into this, Mike, as we get into the conversation, part of what we need to be discussing here as it relates then to broader access for higher education is helping students and families and institutions assess what's the right fit for the student at which institutions. Because one of the brilliant things about American higher education and its history has been its diversity, but I'm afraid right now that's been lost as everyone scrambles to figure out how we reduce cost in higher education.
Looking at college costs from a government perspective, Jim, could you explain how the respondents in the poll felt on the government controlling the cost of college tuition?
Sure. Essentially, they did not really see it as we asked it, gave people 4 options, is who is most responsible for controlling the cost? Is it colleges and universities? Is it parents and students? Is it the federal government? Or is it the state government? And a significant majority either said college and universities, which was 33%, or parents and students, which was 27%. So 60% of people said it was either the colleges or parents. Looking at state and federal government, 19% said state government, 15% said federal government, so that's just 34%. So it's 60% of people choosing essentially something other than government, and 34% of people choosing either state or federal government. And we looked at it by party as well. And again, this is something that we saw bipartisan consensus on. Across the board, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats had college and universities first for who was responsible. And across the board, they all had parents and students second. Now, among Democrats, it wasn't quite as clear cut. 25% said colleges, universities, 25% parents, 24% federal government, and then 20% state governments. So Democrats aren't quite sure, but Republicans, not surprisingly, they want to largely keep the government out of controlling the cost. They want it to be up to first the colleges and then the parents. Among Republicans and Independents, single digits said federal government.
I'm going to give Chad a chance to respond to those findings, partially because the American Action Forum today put out a paper looking at the effects of regulation on college tuition in the last couple of years. So I'm going to let Chad dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more interesting findings of the polling data, in that the people sort of polled put the blame or the onus for the cost of college, somewhat on themselves, or at least on the schools and the universities, which I think there's plenty of blame to go around, but certainly the cost of tuition skyrocketing has to do with the arms race that we've talked about earlier, and it also has some to do with the selection that the parents and students are making, not always being sort of the wisest, most prudent choices or economically feasible choices. That said, though, I mean, with 15% blaming the federal government, 19% blaming state government, I still think that governments, whether at the state or the federal level, are sort of should be held blameless here. I mean, the report that we put out, the American Action Forum put out today, was looking at sort of the regulatory burden on higher education, and our findings in that report showed that there were some 85 million paperwork hours through regulations. The estimated cost of those paperwork hours summed to be around 2.7 billion. That's some substantial, cost. And as far as the universities and colleges shouldering those burdens, we look at BLS data to look at sort of employment, and found that over the past 10 years, administrative staff has gone up 31.5%. Compliance officers, which is a part of the overall administration staff, but compliance officers who deal with complying with regulations has gone up 32.8%. Loan and credit counselors, that has increased over the past years 154%. So certainly, it's worth taking a closer examination on what sort of burdens federal regulations are placing on the schools and university, and how that translates into a 28% increase in tuition.
I think this moves us nicely into the next question, Jim, which was how did people in the poll view the federal government spending on loans and grants and its impact on tuition?
Sure. What we did is we read people the following statement. The statement was, increased federal government spending on student loans and grants has contributed to the rising cost of college tuition, and essentially asked people if they agreed or disagreed with that statement. 54% agreed, so a majority, and 40% disagreed. And intensity was on the side of agreeing too. 31% strongly agreed, just 20% said they strongly disagreed. So it comes that essentially, because it has become easier to get a student loan or a grant from the federal government, it also makes it easier for colleges to increase the tuition, because they know they've got students who can pay for it, because they can come to the federal government and get the loan to do it.
Bill, I want to go to you on this question, just from your perspective, from being within the Department of Education. I was wondering what your views are on the high level of spending going towards loans and grants from the DOE, and how that has played into higher tuition costs recently.
Well, like, it's just as billion to $175 billion. It really is, I think, a true reflection that more and more federal aid is available. But again, we've been hovering in the mid-60s of the number of high school graduates that went on to higher education. The retention rates and the graduation rates are about the same. So, there's an awful lot more money being poured into it, but the quality and the outcomes and the return on the investment that we're seeing are really just not there. I think when we ever talk about this whole college cost issue and the tuition increases, a lot of time we focus on the college campuses, but it really is the individual families that are, I think the college cost issue, and I think the polling data kind of shows as well. The fact is that for middle-class families in this country, the cost of college now eats up half of their household income. And this has been growing for the last 3 decades. But it's killing the purchasing power of American families. And there's a lot of things that are put into these programs, such not allowing you to transfer your credit when you go from one school to another, or a lot of things that colleges do to force kids have to go 5 or 6 years because they don't have some course offerings or everything. There's no incentive for kids to maybe get down in 3 years to minimize their debt and minimize the time that they're spending in college versus getting out into the workforce. So there's a lot of issues at the federal level that really need to be taken and looked at very, very seriously to put some positive incentives in to minimize the amount of debt, but to also maximize the return on the investment that's coming out of our college and universities, and that just is frankly not happening.
Hey, so Mike, if I can add something to this, because this is another interesting finding I found in the poll, that the respondents, again, as we mentioned before, of all these sort of respondents, you ask them, and 9 out of 10 of them are going to say that the cost of college is somewhat or very expensive. That's 9 out of 10 of the people feel that way. And then you take the question a little further and you ask them, well, does federal aid or federal investment, increased federal investment, contribute to that? That's a sort of an argument that has been tried to be proven one way or the other, I think, by policy makers and policy thinkers here in DC, dating back to when Secretary Bennett, I think, first sort of expounded on this sort of theory. So that goes back, several secretaries of education ago, and no one's really been able to prove it or disprove it. But again, in this poll, you ask, everyday Americans, you ask people who are going to have to pay for college, and they, again, overwhelmingly believe, 1, it costs too much, and 2, the increased federal investment in it is not helping with keeping the cost contained.
Ron and Andrew, I want to go to both of you, but just for your different perspectives. Andrew, from your research, and Ron, from just the time you've spent around smaller colleges and universities. Ron, particularly first to you, what is the role that the federal dollars play in enabling students to come to a smaller school that otherwise probably wouldn't be available, and how important is that to these colleges and universities?
Well, obviously it's very critical, and as the rest of the panelists would certainly understand, I mean, public higher education, depending on the state, of course, is subsidized by state budgets. Private colleges and universities indirectly receive support, of course, through federal financial aid, and in some cases state aid as well. When you compare the costs of public and private education, in some cases they compare very favorably, in other cases not so much. So this goes back, Mike, to this comment I made earlier about the diversity in higher education and having academic programs and institutions that, frankly, are priced at different places and will allow for students and their families to make real choices about the education that they can afford. So bottom line is, absolutely, private higher education has benefited from federal financial support, and yet so have public institutions as well. So it's not as though the privates are somehow advantage over publics or vice versa. The federal government assistance for higher education really goes, of course, to individual students and not to institutions.
Andrew, is there anything you'd like to add on top of that on the role that federal dollars are playing to, and how they impact tuition that you've seen?
Yeah, so the latest research is largely finding that there is a relationship between increasing tuition and increasing aid, and that's different from the previous research in the sense that we're now starting to look at individual programs. So before we were kind of lumping all the aid together, and it turns out that the aid programs may have different impacts on tuition. So that we're really seeing kind of advances in the research, and the story that's kind of emerging is that you do need to worry about tuition being driven higher by these aid programs. For some of the programs, you don't need to worry about it as much for others. So if you take something like the Grad Plus program, this provides almost unlimited loans to graduate students. That allows graduate schools to raise their tuition pretty much without limit. On the other side, if you take something like the GI Bill grants to veterans, that's not available to enough students, and it's capped. So it's not really going to lead to tuition inflation at the colleges. So you really need to think about the structure of the individual programs, and so the more we can move away from more aid leads to higher tuition and more towards aid of this type leads to higher tuition, the better we'll be.
Yeah, and so one other thing I would add to that is just, it's not just putting one program or the other program sort of on an island and examining those, but examining sort of a couple of those linked together. So for instance, you could take Grad Plus, Parent Plus, any of them, where they have this sort of unlimited loan ability, but then you couple that with sort of income-based repayment, and you have a savvy sort of lender who looks at that and says, look, I'm going to borrow a whole bunch of money, but I know that if I get out and get the right kind of mix of job or whatever, I'm not going to have to pay all this back. And so that, again, sort of drives up that those aid dollars.
I just want to take a moment to remind everyone watching that if you have any questions for our panel, you can use the hashtag AAF chat, so that's pound AAF chat, and we will pass along your questions to our panelists. Moving forward, Jim, one of the more interesting findings, I think, from our poll had to deal with the cost of college and the debt and whether or not students felt it was worth it, and also coupling that with how much they thought was appropriate for someone to have to pay back monthly out of their income after college.
Sure. We told respondents that the average student after graduating from a four-year college owes $26,500 in debt. And then we asked if a four-year college degree was worth that amount of student loan debt. 42% said yes, that it was, and 52% said no, it was not worth that amount of debt. So a majority, a slim majority, but still a majority, said that essentially that was too much debt to pay for a four-year college degree. And one thing that was really interesting is that by age, there were some pretty stark differences. Essentially, people age 45 plus were more or less split about whether it was worth it or not. But 18 to 34-year-olds, 29% said yes, that it was worth it. 66% said no, that it was not. Not entirely sure what makes younger people so convinced that it's not worth that amount of debt. It could be that they are just out of college and having to pay back that amount of debt and know that it's pretty tough to do. It could be that they're earning a lower salary and that the $26,500 is just a little bit more daunting. We're not entirely sure on the why for it, but it is something definitely worth taking note of. And then on the other question we asked was approximately what percentage of their income should a college graduate with student loan debt have to pay towards their loans each month? And the mean score, the average that we got, was 12.2%. The interesting thing was we didn't really have a big range of scores. Everyone kind of came in right at this level. And the other issue with this, if, as people wanted, they had to pay back 12% each month, if that was, for example, if that just happened to become the national law on student loans, the difficulty there is essentially a big chunk of that would be you're just paying back the interest on the loan. It would take a long time to really start to make a meaningful reduction in the principal, even at that 12% rate.
Bill, I want to go to you first, and particularly the first part about the $26,000 in debt and whether or not students and particularly young respondents in our poll felt that for the majority of them, felt that it wasn't worth it. How serious of a problem could that be? Is that something that colleges should be concerned about, or is that something that you think is more of a reflection of these are students that recently graduated, so they are dealing with the debt, so they have more negative feelings on that?
I think I need to give you a schizophrenic answer, but I think on the plus side, $26,000 debt on the face of it is like buying an automobile, and I think for most people looking at that amount of debt, it's probably smart debt if you're getting your degree, and if you're going to get into a job when you get out of college, it's going to give you the ability to pay that back. And I think this is very challenging in today's economy, where we have 45% of our college graduates living at home with such a weak economy and a weak job market. Back when I was in college, I'm a lot older than all you guys, but in 1979, a high school graduate at that time would earn 77 cents on the dollar if a college graduate would earn. Today it's 62 cents per dollar. So, I think in general it's obviously a good investment to make, but it has to be a smart investment. And again, it goes back to our loan and grant programs and a lot of, I think, some of the challenges on college campuses where, most of the default problems and the debt problems are students that get into college for 1 or 2 years and they assume a bunch of debt and then they drop out of college and they don't have the skill sets or the abilities to get into the job market and pay that loan back. And so, there's also a ton of examples of people that are over borrowing. They're getting a liberal arts degree and taking $50,000 to $100,000 in debt out, really not doing that cost benefit ROI analysis on what is the degree that they're taking, is it going to give them the ability to pay that loan back. So I think one of the challenges we also have with the way that the programs are handled today, there's really not a lot of debt counseling and financial literacy going on to really help students pick the right school, pick the right degree, get the right financing and the right aid package to get to school so that when they get out, they are going to be able to get that loan paid back with a good job that their degree is hopefully going to lead them to.
Ron, I'd like to go to you. Just your response from a college perspective. Would this poll be troubling to people in college administrations that see that the majority of respondents didn't think that a college degree was worth $26,000 in debt?
Well, I'm going to borrow from Bill's response. I think yes and no. At one level, this is a snapshot, and of course, one of the things that any university or college leader would want to ask is, longitudinally, what's the trend line? But if the trend line, as anecdotally seems to be, that more and more people are questioning the value of an education, higher education, then absolutely this should be troubling. On the other side of this, though, I think smart academic leaders are going to look at a poll like this and others that are out there and say, okay, so what are the ways in which we must continue to appropriately both make the case for and organize our own academic programs and services around ways of meeting real student needs so that when they graduate from our university or our college, they are positioned to be in the workforce. But to Bill's point earlier, it is a concern when we have graduation rates at some institutions that whether it's public or private, that are well below 50%. And if I'm a parent of a student, I want to know if my son or daughter starts at this institution, what's the likelihood that they'll actually finish? So to answer your question, Mike, I think those in higher education, whether they're in the public or private sector, should take notice of a poll like this, but then ask the question, the next question, so what do we do about it? What is the response that we as educators need to be making in order to convince parents and students of the continued value of the education, and how do we continue to work on controlling costs?
Andrew, I'm going to go to you with the second part of that polling question, which was how much is an appropriate amount to pay back? And the mean score was 12.2, but as Jim said, the vast majority of the responses were right around that area. In your research, is there a mean appropriate number that is pretty typical of what students are paying back now, and how close is that to that 12.2%?
So I think the mean is a little bit below the 12.2% in the survey, and once you get too much higher than about 12%, it becomes very, very difficult for the student to make their payments, because little life setbacks can quickly snowball, and so I'd say that strikes me as about the right range for where we should be trying to go in a public policy perspective in terms of repayment percentage.
Jim, moving on to another topic, there's been some support recently for the idea of streamlining federal loans and grants to one kind of federal loan and one kind of federal grant for students. but it's also potential that this could come at the expense of lower income students. How did folks in the poll view that?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. We were very upfront about the fact that this streamlining process could make things a little more difficult to help the neediest students. We included that right in the question, and even with including that, we had 52% who were in favor of streamlining the process and 43% who opposed. And I wouldn't say the support was bipartisan, but we did have 57% of Republicans, 56% of independents, so majority is there, and even 47% of Democrats were in favor of this as well. 50% were opposed, so pretty split down the middle, but it is something where there was some consensus across the partisan lines. It wasn't something where support with the Republicans was 80% and with Democrats was 20%, which is what we see on a lot of issues. There was some sense of bipartisanship here.
Yeah, I would say this is pretty reflective of sort of how policymakers up on Capitol Hill are sort of feeling as well. I mean, I think in both the House and the Senate, there's been proposals floated to streamline the federal aid process. There's a couple of proposals, I believe, floating in both the House and the Senate on this one loan, one grant. Both of those, I believe, have bipartisan support. So it's policymakers, are feeling that this is sort of safe ground, and it's certainly something that hopefully they can explore and work out in any sort of higher education reauthorization that may be coming in the year or two ahead.
Bill, I want to go to you with this question, and if you could just talk about how a proposal like this would completely alter the landscape, going to one type of federal loan, one type of federal grant, opposed to the current system.
I think it's a good idea generally. I think trying to simplify and streamline the federal aid programs is always important, but I think one challenge you always get with the one-size-fits-all federal program, no matter what area we're talking about in government, I do think it really creates some challenges to meet the individual needs of students and families that are out there. One idea I actually wrote about in a book for AEI a few years ago, and I think the idea is still pertinent now, is that some of the folks talking about having one grant, one loan, and one tax credit program, and I frankly am a little bit leery of some of the tax credits and other type of opportunities over there, because I don't think that really ever helps on the access front. I don't think it helps on the affordability front. And I frankly think that true simplification would maybe be to also take a look at a lot of the tax issues that are out there and to possibly redirect some of that financial aid to help needy students, or to help maybe front load the grant program so that students again are not maybe taking debt in their first year or two, especially those that might be dropping out. So I think it's a little more complex than all of this, but there's a lot of money on the table. As I said, $175 billion just in the grant and the loan money, plus the tax monies, and I think there's enough there for us to really take a step back and design a program that is simpler, streamlined, but also has the ability to meet the individual needs of especially some of the disadvantaged students that we'd like to make sure have an opportunity to get a higher education. I also, let me just add one other thing too. The federal government does, the reauthorization bills really tend to always focus on, the federal level. I frankly think there's a lot of great things going on at the state level. Tennessee, Governor Haslam passed, I think, a great bill where the state funding is going out based on merit of the institutions and its performance-based pay that's being sent out to the state university systems based on their performance. There's also private sector solutions out there. Senators Rubio and Congressman Peacock introduced a bill regarding this income share agreement notion, and there's an awful lot of smart people out in the private sector that are looking to how you can use private capital and private sector expertise to help bring some solutions to the table as well. And, I think most of the time the reauthorization process gets so focused on the federal side of things that it really misses the broader opportunities at the state and at the private sector level.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that there is a couple things. One, there's room for sort of the private sector solution on student financial aid. There's room to improve that. And then, on the federal side, while the policymakers are looking at sort of, reauthorizing the higher ed bill and looking at changing the federal student aid, there's room to improve things like within the Pell Grant program on sort of an increased number of students who are accessing those dollars, and really sort of re-examining those dollars as a needs-based dollars, and sort of targeting those dollars to those who really need it, and not sort of casting such a wide net of access to those dollars.
All right, taking another moment to plug our hashtag. If you guys have any questions for our panel, if you just send them with the hashtag AAFchat, we will pass them along to our panel, and we can possibly get in one or two here before we're done. I want to, Jim, move us along a different direction from cost of college and loans and grants and debt to the responsibility of getting a college degree. This is another question in the poll on where does the onus fall on someone getting a college degree, whether or not that's the role of governments or the universities or the students themselves or their parents. So if you could dive into the poll's findings on that.
Yeah, to put it simply, the finding is it's up to you or it's up to your parents. We gave people 5 options, whether it was of who was most responsible, whether it was parents of students, state governments, federal government, or college and universities. Students were number 1 at 36%. Parents of students were just behind them at 32%. So 68% said, hey, it's either up to you or your parents. And then the other 3, federal government just over single digits at 12%, college and universities at 9%, and state governments at 7%. So it's something that, again, like we saw with the cost of college, the opportunity to go to college is not something where people are putting the main responsibility on government, either federal or state.
Ron, I'd like to go to you first. Do you think this finding, hearing that the vast majority, if you lump parents and students together, the vast majority of Americans feel that that responsibility falls on individual parents and students, do you think that's maybe just a reflection of American culture, that idea of the American dream, or is that maybe the role that it's more of a reflection on the role of governments and colleges and universities in our culture?
Mike, it's a great question, and I think in some ways the fact that the results are a bit mixed may also reflect the broader policy debate in this country right now about the appropriate role of government in all kinds of sectors. And so I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what to make of those results. I think on the one hand, if you segment them probably along ideological lines, you'll find, not surprisingly, you'll find people that tend towards a more progressive side will see a larger role for government, and those out of a more conservative political perspective would see less of that role. But because historically higher education has been seen as one rite of passage towards the American dream, it does seem to me that, and this is what I like about this poll, there are opportunities to re-examine both the purpose and value of higher education in relationship to the changes that are taking place in society. So why focus simply on cost? Let's begin to focus on outcomes and making sure that a higher education good is accessible and affordable to those families and to those students who are prepared to do the work to achieve it. So it's mixed, much like the results are with some of the other questions that we've considered earlier this afternoon.
I guess I would just open the question up to the rest of the panel, kind of like we did to the respondents in the poll. We heard Ron's views that it's mixed. Would the folks on the panel agree with that, or do you think there's a greater role for parents or students versus governments versus the colleges and universities themselves? Ron, or Bill, if you want to go first, or Chad. Go ahead, Chad.
I would certainly agree that there's sort of an individual onus put on each and every person to be prepared to succeed at the next level of education. But there's certainly, roles for both state and federal governments to make sure that, should a student be prepared, that there aren't necessarily obstacles, not of their makings, sort of preventing them from accessing, higher education.
I would echo what Chad said. I think that we really, parents and students, it's really where it should start. But I do believe that one of the things the government can do better is providing information to help families and students make better decisions about what the return on investment is, what the outcome expectations will be. But I also think we need to also have our programs designed in a way to help families and students make decisions about their post-secondary education experience. Many students don't need to go to college. They may prefer to go directly into the workforce. They may need to go back to college at some point in the future to retool some of their skills as the job markets change, technology changes. But there's a lot of students as well that maybe just need to get a certificate or a training program or a 2-year degree to get in the field of work that they're wanting to get into. And I think it really is important in a lot of those type of programs. Families and students are given a great deal of thought to that, and I think that and I use this term completion with a purpose that I think is very important. That no matter what you're completing, whether it's high school or community college, a certificate or a 4-year degree, everything that families should be working towards with their students getting through college is to make sure whatever degree it is or certificate it is they're coming out with, that they're going to be able to have a purposeful life and to be able to have their education lead to a meaningful job and an ability to care for themselves and their families in the years ahead.
Yeah, Mike, I would add one more thing, and this sort of thought just came to me. I don't remember when we sort of asked the question in the actual poll, whether it was an open-ended question or if we had, a selection to choose from. But what's interesting is not showed here is sort of the responsibility of the K-12 system, which certainly bears some burden on ensuring that students have an opportunity to be successful and to receive a college degree. So I don't know, maybe we can talk whether or not, I don't know, Jim, was that a part? Do you remember how we phrased that question?
That was not an option that was read. It wasn't an open-ended question. We just read folks the 5 options. And another thing that I would point out, just kind of thinking about question perception, is that I would hypothesize that a lot of the respondents, when they were thinking about responsibility, it was whose job is it to get someone to be a high school senior and be qualified to go to college, so to speak. I think that's one of the reasons we got such high number of people saying either parents of students or students, is that it's their job to make the grades, to make sure that they're not cutting class, not to make sure that they're taking SATs or ACTs or whatever standardized test they might need to take along the way. And then in their eyes, it may have been that, okay, once you're qualified for college, hey, everybody gets to go.
Moving along to one issue quick, Ron, that I wanted to get to with you, and Jim, I'll have you touch on the poll's findings real quickly, but the polling also asked respondents about their views of alternative college programs. In other words, like prior learning assessments or massive open online courses, and whether or not they saw that as viable options to alternatives to the traditional college classroom. Jim, if you could just touch on those findings really quick, and then Ron, I just want to come back and see from the perspective of a college whether or not they think that you feel that that's a direction that a lot of colleges are going to be moving away from that traditional college classroom.
Yeah, just touching on this briefly, both prior learning assessments and massive open line courses had very strong support. For prior learning assessments, 89% favored them, and with 66% strongly favoring. For the massive online courses, 82% favor with 51% strongly favor. So very strong favor numbers and also very good intensity as well. So from the public, at least, there's definitely some support there.
And picking up on the results of the poll, Mike, I do think that you're going to see change because, in effect, the marketplace is going to demand it. Now, that doesn't mean that every college and university is going to run out, and in fact, there are studies that indicate that the costs associated with starting, for example, online programs can be, in some cases, more than it is to offer traditional programs. So colleges and universities have to be very careful about how they respond to these marketplace pressures. On the other hand, acknowledging prior work, for example, and granting credit, those are decisions that are often held, of course, at the level of the faculty, and institutions that are able to sort of structure those conversations among the faculty and others who have administrative responsibility and can respond to those pressures in creative ways, I think will have a leg up. As it relates to massive open online courses, again, I think it's a little early to tell. I mean, there's some like Clayton Christensen who think that this is a wave of the future, but the traditional residential model of higher education isn't something that's going to go away anytime soon. I think you will see campuses trying to diversify their educational portfolios to respond to pressures in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think Ron's spot on, and I think the one thing that we really got to focus on is we're always going to have the traditional students 18 to 24 years old that are going to be looking for the traditional education. But the fact is we also have 85 million Americans who have had some higher education but have not completed a degree, and so this is really why I think with the soft economy, the tough job market, we're going to just really see more and more of the demand for these types of alternative education scenarios. And sometimes people just need a short-term program. Other times, I think these competency-based programs out there like Western Governors University are just terrific where it gives people that are 30, 40, 45 years old the ability to take what they've learned in the real world and to get an accelerated degree so that they don't have to leave their family and leave their jobs to go to an on-campus experience, but to get up to a quality alternative means. And so I think just the demographics are such to where I think it's going to continue to really disrupt the higher education marketplace as we know it. And again, I think Ron's spot on. We're always going to have the need for the traditional higher education delivery system, but we really need to be open to these new entrants and these new possibilities so that we can make sure that we really are providing opportunities for everybody to get the type of post-secondary education they need to get the job they need.
So, Mike, not to hijack your moderating, but I think Andrew, who I think has written some on this issue, it'd be interesting to get his take.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the great advantages of these online courses is that the marginal cost is essentially zero of adding another student. And that's going to tend to push the price towards zero. Now, it'll never actually reach zero, but it's going to tend to push the price down. And that's almost a totally unheard of concept in higher ed. Price always goes up. And now we got this huge force that's potentially going to start pushing prices down. And that alone will have very disruptive effects if it takes hold. And competency-based education can more easily be incorporated into one of these kind of automated smart systems where the program adapts to the user's inputs and right answers and wrong answers and stuff like that. So this is definitely a very potentially disruptive force. Like everybody's been saying, we're still in the early stages of it. So basically what we're getting right now are videotaped lectures. But that's not going to last forever. And as we start seeing the next generation of these things, that's when we'll probably see a little bit more disruption. And we'll really know when the disruption will take off, when you can actually get a low-cost degree that's reasonably respected in the marketplace from this.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the interesting thing to look for in the future. Having spoken with some colleagues over at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., they're working on getting George Washington sort of involved or gearing up to have sort of George Washington Online University. And one of the principles they're grappling with is GW is a very expensive school, for tuition-wise to actually attend in person. It's a very expensive school, and I think they like having their tuition at that certain sort of price level because it gives them a certain amount of prestige. But when they launch into this sort of online, it's driving down the cost. And so how does the school, the physical school itself, battle with providing essentially what could be the same education at a cheaper cost when they're not really looking to drive down sort of the cost of their education?
As we're running down on time, I want to do one more question with the panel. The poll also examined the administration's proposal plan to provide rates or impose, cost rates for public colleges, or penalize those that would charge too much in tuition to private schools. Jim, if you could just dive into how the public viewed this type of a proposal.
Sure, yeah. To be specific, we asked them if the federal government should have the authority to set price controls on public colleges and universities, and then also have the authority to penalize colleges and universities that they think are too expensive. We had 44% favor, 55% opposed, but the interesting thing was the difference in intensity. By a 2-to-1 margin, the intensity for the opposition at 42% was higher than the intensity for those who favored it at 22%. So it was something where it wasn't an overwhelming majority opposing the proposal, but the intensity was definitely on the side of the opposition.
Bill, could you just dive into how much this would change the landscape of public colleges and how they set their prices, and private colleges as well, like being impacted of potentially being penalized for charging too much for tuition?
Yeah, it's, and again, this is, I think it's a proposal that hopefully will not ever see the light of day. It's the federal government is very good at doing some things. They collect an awful lot of data for the Department of Education. They're not so good at getting the data out into a transparent way for parents and families to make good decisions. Again, having the federal government be the issue of a report card for college campuses, I think, is very much misplaced. I think there are some opportunities again for the private sector, for states and others to serve that function in a way that would be much more closer to the customer, or much more customer friendly. This should not be a punitive thing per se. It really should be a way to use the accountability systems to help improve the product, help return the return on investment, to help return the results and outcomes for students and families at the university. So I think having a one-size-fits-all approach, the federal government's already trying to do this with these gainful employment regulations that are being issued on the for-profit colleges and universities, and it's just very difficult to do these, enforce these without having unintended consequences. So again, I think the data that's out there, the accountability systems would be much better left to independent third parties, as well as state and other institutions that are much closer to the customer.
Ron, I was going to go to you, and just out of curiosity, a plan like this that would take the ability to control tuition costs potentially, well, fully away from public schools and partially away from private schools. How do you think college boards would react to this kind of a plan?
I'm in full agreement with Bill. I think this is not likely to be embraced by publics or privates. The idea that somehow the government would sanction institutions where their costs were perceived to be too high. And here's part of the challenge with this, and it goes to something Bill talked about in terms of even the collection of data. There are significant debates right now, even within the higher education community, about how you measure quality, for example, how you control your understanding of graduation rates, because certain institutions are basically aligned to take, for example, community colleges take students at a certain, often at a certain academic level, versus a high-profile institution where their selectivity is much higher. So how does one measure apples to apples when it comes to the so-called costs associated with the type of student that comes to your institution and whether they even graduate? So we need to rethink or recast the conversation to say, what is the value of higher education for society? What are the intended outcomes? If the outcomes are simply graduation, that's one thing. But if actually outcomes can be self-improvement, gaining additional skills along the way, lots of students will stop out their college education. When do you measure so-called completion rates? You begin to see, Mike, the complexity of the federal government trying to get into the game of determining whether an institution's costs are too high or not. I don't think you're going to find much support among college and university boards for this, for certain.
Andrew and Chad, I'll open it both up to you to close this out if either of you would like to comment on this issue and the poll's findings.
So there's kind of a tension within the proposed ratings. They aren't really sure if they want it to be a consumer information tool or an accountability tool. And if it's a consumer information tool, I'm with everybody else that it'll be bad, they aren't going to do it right, and it would be better done by other people. But if it's an accountability tool, it's really something that only the federal government can do, because it's an accountability tool to adjust how much financial aid students at various colleges can get. Because right now we basically have a one-size-fits-all system. If you convince an accreditor that you're a college, you get access to federal financial aid programs. And that's not working out so well because there's vast differences in the quality of these programs. Now, whether we can accurately measure the differences in the quality of these programs and fine-tune kind of the rewards and punishments accordingly, that's definitely very much an open question, but the goal, I think, is wise. I think we do, from an accountability perspective, we need to move away from treating all the colleges the same.
Yeah, and I would just add that, from the accountability perspective, the ratings tool or whatever as an accountability measure, and limiting sort of access to federal financial aid. I rank that right up with price fixing, and I know sort of way to deal with the issue. Certainly, we can look at finding a way to judge and score the quality of certain institutions, but setting and fixing prices for those institutions, I don't think the federal government has historically a good track record at such endeavors.
All right, thank you. I want to thank everyone that joined us today on our Google Hangout. I want to thank all of our guests, Bill Hansen, Andrew Gillen, Jim Hobart, Ron Mahurin, and Chad Miller. And this entire Google Hangout will be available online. We'll put the whole thing on YouTube. So in case you missed part of it, you can come back and watch the full thing. But a special thank you to all of our guests. It's been a very interesting conversation, and look forward to doing it again. Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike.